Hello, my name is Rik Pancholi. I'm a Senior Associate here at Edward Ansell Lewis, and today I'm going to be talking you through a few legal tips for starting a business. By way of an introduction, many of the tips provided in this webinar are not only legal, but they're commercial observations, as the two often go hand in hand. So I'm going to show you how thinking about the business lifecycle from start to growth through to exit when embarking on a new business venture can help to structure the thought process of a well-organized and robust founder and startup. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk you through a fictional scenario which has been created it's designed to help you understand a few of the legal tips and how they can interlink, and why establishing the thought process from the beginning through to exit can actually help make life easier for you as a founder or a business advisor. So in our fictional scenario, Steve has just taken a redundancy package and he wants to use that money and invest it into a new business venture. He's currently looking at 4 different options. Firstly, he could actually go part-time and enjoy the benefits of having all of this extra cash brings him in terms of extra time. He could look at an existing operation and franchise. He could maybe buy an existing business. And lastly, he's exploring looking at a startup, creating a concept from new, from inception, and taking it through to wherever it can go. Looking at Steve's concept, his concept is to produce goods which he is passionate about. Stripy socks. He knows he wants to sell online, and he knows that he needs a robust business plan. So tip number 1, produce a business plan before you get into business. It will help to force you, it will force you to think about the difficult issues before you actually part with your hard-earned cash. Looking at the business structures, he knows that he wants to sell socks, but he doesn't know how to actually structure it. He doesn't have a partner, and he wants to make sure that he understands will the business actually be successful? Will it go somewhere? So does he take the risks of having a sole partnership model with the potential liabilities that go with it? Or does he actually go into a limited company? The question is, if he approaches it as a sole trader, is he going to be setting himself up for a fall? His liability isn't limited, and if he wants to get more people on board in the future, he may have to consider revisiting the structure. So tip number 2, choose an appropriate business structure to the business that you're actually looking to invest in. The main thing to note here is it's not all about law. There are a few other things that Steve in this example has explored. He's carried out some market research, he's thought about the branding, he's instructed a web developer to create an e-commerce website. He's decided to take on a risk. He hasn't put in place a web development agreement. And to sort of capture a few of the things that you may want to consider in a web development agreement, we're actually looking at the scope of the work. We're looking at the project proposal. We're looking at what the website's actually going to do. Is it going to be interactive? Is it not? What happens if there's a delay? What happens if your developer actually decides to push the project back by a few weeks? Is it going to impact on the website? Is it going to impact on the business? There are a few things that should be considered, and in this scenario, Steve's decided to take a risk. The other things he's thought about is not only finalizing the business plan, but he needs to understand that a business plan may never actually be finalized. It's an evolving document. It changes every year and needs to be revisited based on what's happening. He's decided to self-finance. Steve's now working from home, and he's got his appropriate insurances in place. So tip number 3 is that business is not just all about the law. Looking at the website, the Socks and Stripes website has launched. Some of the things that Steve now needs to think about is what actually happens on his website. Has he thought about how customers can buy the socks? Has he thought about the payment issues, the SSL certificates? He has, and he's decided to allow a third-party merchant services provider to accept payments on his site. He's also decided to sell advertising space for a Thai retailer. So what does Steve need to do? He needs a set of e-commerce terms and conditions relating to the trading part of the site. This will cover things like delivery, payment, warranties as to quality, cancellation policies, and an ability for the recipient to reject the socks for specific reasons. The terms and conditions, and this is quite important, the terms and conditions should be accepted at the point of purchase. Looking at the other things that are involved with this website, what about the Contact Us form? Contact Us forms are generally interactive areas of the website, and there are privacy issues that need to be addressed or at least considered, and these can involve looking at the personal information that is being captured and what's actually going to happen with that personal information. So the privacy policy tells a site visitor what Steve is going to do with their information. Steve's intention is to use the information to add them onto a mailing list, and this is part of his marketing strategy. So in turn, the privacy policy needs to be quite clear on this. There may also be other obligations, including registration with the Information Commissioner's Office, and these are all the other issues that need to be addressed by Steve. Another area to consider, and this relates partly towards the other part of the business, which what Steve wants to do with the website, which is use the website as targeted marketing, targeted advertising. So when we're looking at his website actually remembering customers when they're visiting, we need to consider the cookie policy. A cookie is a small text file which is placed on websites by their customer's computer. Sorry, it's placed on the customer's computer by the websites, and it allows the website to remember what the customer preferences are or in their shopping basket. It's quite important for things like behavioral and targeted advertising, and Steve's policies need to be quite clear on this. We also have various legislation that we need to comply with and need to make sure that the site visitor is actually accepting the cookies before they're placed on the computer. So looking at the terms of use for the website, what about the site generally? What if the information contained in it is accidentally incorrect? Who's going to take responsibility if there's a link to an external website? Where is that division of responsibility? What happens if a customer downloads a virus? What about the advertising? Is there a copyright policy related to the content? These are some of the things that you need to think about, or Steve needs to think about, when he's actually pulling together his terms of use policy. And it helps Steve to understand that a website and owning and controlling a website has many more risks and opportunities than he first thought. Tip number 4 is don't forget the e-commerce terms, the terms of use, privacy, cookie policies, especially if the business is growing. So, the next stage for Steve is exploring where this business is going. Bucky owns a business called Star Ties, and he wants to merge his business with Steve's. So if we take a step back and look back at the business structure right at the beginning, if Steve had met Bucky earlier, then the structure may have been a partnership from the outset. So Steve is attracted to Bucky's business model because Bucky's distribution channel is a market stall. By merging the two businesses, Steve has access to a market stall and Bucky has access to an online market. The two businesses are quite complementary. Tip number 5, even if you've been trading for a while, you must continually review your business plan and your legal structure. So, is it time to limit liability? Socks, Stripes and Ties Limited. So, the company buys the business assets of Socks and Stripes, including the website, supplier list, contracts and stock. The company also buys the business and assets of the tie business, including the market stall agreement, stock and goodwill, but not the supplier contracts. They've decided to leave that with Bucky. So Bucky now assumes that liability. Talking about finance, how did the company actually finance the acquisition? Steve and Bucky loaned money to the company based on advice from their accountant, and a loan agreement was put in place. So tip number 6 is to consider how the business is to be financed, then to review it periodically because the options and opportunities change. The risk profile of the clients also change. So now we're looking at the ownership structure. Steve and Bucky each own 50% of Socks, Stripes and Ties Limited. What do they need to do? they need to consider things like shareholders agreements. What if Steve wants to put his shares into a family trust? That's just one of the many things that you can capture in a shareholders agreement. And looking at the scope of this webinar, we won't go into too much detail here, but Steve and Bucky have taken advice and put a shareholders agreement in place. It effectively regulates the conduct between themselves as shareholders and includes things like preemptive rights on share transfers, the ability to transfer into family trusts, board of director powers, restrictive covenants should one of them leave, and deadlock scenarios. So this is where the shareholders have a difference of opinion on selected areas. So what happens if one of them dies, becomes mentally unstable, or is declared bankrupt? And we'll call one of these things an event. So in this scenario, Bucky doesn't want Steve's wife Natasha to own the shares. So what they do is they put in place cross-option agreements backed by life insurance policies. On Steve's death, the option to buy his shares will trigger, and Bucky will buy those shares at market value using proceeds of the life insurance payout. The end position is that Natasha receives payment for Steve's hard work. Bucky becomes the owner of the company in its entirety, which means that the money is placed with the person who wants it, and the business is placed with the person who wants it. The idea being that the business survives an event. Tip number 7 is to plan ahead. It's cheaper than going into litigation. And when these sorts of scenarios do go wrong, it can become quite costly. And there's also an emotional strain on all parties concerned, because emotions come into play, which is why it's important to make sure that you've planned far in advance. Let's talk about another area, which is property. So Socks, Stripes and Ties Limited wants a shop. They've outgrown the market stall. They find a location, they've entered into a lease, and this is where they have to start to think about things that they didn't necessarily have to think about before, including obligations of repair and what they can use the premises for. In line with their growth plans, they take on employees to run the shop and therefore need employment contracts in addition to their own director service agreements. This ensures the company is compliant with employment law obligations, and depending on how they want to view it, they may decide to pay a monthly retainer to a HR services provider to make sure that they've got service as and when they need it without incurring one-off ad hoc fees. So tip number 8, people buy from people, but the contracts set out the minimum levels of expectation. Expansion. Steve and Bucky want to open a second store and they need £100,000 to do this. The question is, how are they going to fund this? Looking at different sources of funding. There's banks, private investors and organic growth. So banks are likely to want security, maybe a legal charge over property. Note here there's no freehold. They may look at debenture over assets, personal guarantees from the directors. Could be a number of things. Private investors, we're looking at investment agreement territory. They may look for equity stakes, placement of an executive board member, may take shares with preferential treatments. They may look at loan notes. Could be a mixture of things depending on the appetite of a particular investor, and also looking at what they've done before, their track history, and whether they can actually bring a level of knowledge and expertise to the business. And lastly, we're going to look at organic growth and internal promotion. So Clint and Wade want to invest their key employees. However, Clint has the money, Wade doesn't. What are the options that we are going to consider here? Steve and Bucky are looking at organic growth. They want to incentivize Wade. So what they want to do, because Wade doesn't have the cash up front, they want to allot shares of only one specific class with only a right of value on exit. He doesn't share in dividends or have a right to vote, but if the company is sold, he will benefit. So looking at the organic growth model and purely basing this on ordinary shares, putting Wade's shares to the side for a second, Clint becomes a 20% shareholder based on market valuation in terms of voting and dividends. So we've now got Clint at 20, Steve at 40, Bucky at 40. What do they need to consider? We've already covered off shareholders agreements and we've already covered off cross options. We've touched on class rights of shares and given them different rights of voting, dividend, value on exit. What about cash flow? This goes back to funding, and tip number 9 is therefore it's important to consider funding issues from the outset and to continually review them as circumstances change. Another area to consider is innovation and IP. So Wade begins to design his own range, and the company needs to consider design rights whether we're looking at registered or unregistered. Why does the company need to consider it? Well, in Wade's contract of employment and in the shareholders agreement, we generally like to make sure that the IP created whilst working at the company is owned by the company. In terms of trademarking, is the logo available? Is it ready to be trademarked? Do they want to consider that? Do they want to consider the copyright in their promotional material and their website? Other areas which probably won't apply here in our scenario are patent protection. It doesn't strictly apply, but it's something that may apply in another scenario. Tip number 10 is intellectual property should be protected properly, even from those closest to the company. So this goes back to what we said at the beginning, which is keeping an eye on the exit door. When starting up, the business plan may consider forecasts for the next year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, longer, maybe shorter. The exit plan isn't always about selling the business